Well, welcome back to lecture number 6, and we move on now to another location in the road trip that is Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, and that is to the Palace Beautiful. Now, we left Christian. You remember he had come across simple sloth and presumption at the sepulchre, and then a little further on he had met formalist and hypocrisy, who had gone along two different roads called danger and destruction. And instead, Christian had ascended up a hill, and halfway up that hill, he stops at an arbor and falls asleep. Actually, we didn't say this last time because it's more important to say it here, that when he awoke and before he went on his journey to discover that he'd lost the scroll and had to make his way back again, he met briefly two other characters, one called Mistrust and another called Timorous. And they are heading backwards. And they are shouting at Christian, warning him that terrible danger lies ahead. Well, now that he's back at the arbor, he's found his scroll again, found his assurance. He spies now in the distance a wonderful, stately palace called Beautiful. And it's just beyond the top of the hill called Difficulty. And Christian decides that this is a good place to lodge for the night. Now, this is Bunyan describing allegorically, you understand. Pilgrim's Progress is an allegory. He's describing allegorically the church. The church for Bunyan was Palace Beautiful. I wonder what we might call it. The church. A building, for sure. But I wonder what name, I wonder how we would describe the body of Christ. The place where we gather together as the Lord's people, the place where we make solemn vows of fellowship with one another and oblige ourselves to care for one another, where the Word of God is preached, where we are fed and nourished, and where we grow and where we find such wonderful things. And Bunyan loved the church. Those 12 years of almost solitary confinement. It wasn't really solitary confinement. He was allowed visitors, and I think his family were allowed to visit him and bring him food in the prison, in the cell in Bedford. But to be away from the church and to be away from an institution that he loved because he saw it as the body of Christ. I think of the words of John Calvin in the Institutes. He's quoting Cyprian, the early church father, that no one can have God as his father who doesn't have the church as his mother. And that's how Calvin put it. Now, for Bunyan, the church was a beautiful thing. And he describes it in terms of great affection here. You can read his account of his own admission into the local church at Bedford, where the minister was John Gifford, who discipled him as a young Christian. The bride of Christ is adorned in all of her beauty. It is built by the Lord of the hill, and he built it for the relief and security of pilgrims, Bunyan says about Palace Beautiful. For Bunyan especially, living in the 17th century when debates about the nature of the Church of Christ on earth were strong, the church becomes a topic for sermons and books and debates of all kind. And Bunyan had done a great deal of thinking about the church. And so here, I want us to look at this Palace Beautiful and what sort of things go on here as he tries to describe allegorically what the church is like. Now, the first thing is that the church can expect satanic resistance. I think Bunyan is thinking of that seminal passage in Matthew 16 at Caesarea Philippi. I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. He builds his church in enemy-occupied territory. He builds his church right up against the walls of Hades itself. Before Christian enters Palace Beautiful, he sees two lions. It was this that had made mistrust and timorous run backwards and warn Christian that terrible danger lay ahead. At the door of the palace, there is a man who's called the Porter, who says to Christian, "Is thy strength so small? Fear not the lions, for they are chained and are placed there for trial of faith, where it is, and for discovery of those that have none. Keep in the midst of the path, and no hurt shall come unto thee." Right? So he walks down the center of the path. The lions can't get at him. But notice how Bunyan introduces the two possibilities: to try the faith of those who have faith, and to discover those who perhaps, like timorous and mistrust, who actually didn't have faith and ran backwards. Now, Christian doesn't see, we are told in the narrative, but Christian doesn't see that the two lions are chained. Now, interpreters have a little bit of a field day here. Who are these two lions? What are they supposed to represent in the allegory? And it's a fairly standard and somewhat obvious thing to explore, that perhaps one of the lions represents the authority of the state, and another lion represents the authority/tyranny of the church. Remember, Bunyan has been at the mercy of both. He has refused to conform to the standards of the Church of England. He's a nonconformist. He's a Baptist to boot in the 17th century. He's a Puritan. He's a non-conforming Puritan Baptist preacher. So he's fallen foul both of the restorationist government of Charles II, the state, but he's also fallen foul of the church. And it's probable that these two lions represent the church and state that are out to get people like Bunyan. Now, of course, where did he get the analogy of a lion that's on a chain? And of course, Revelation 20 is the obvious answer to that, that Satan is released, but he's on a chain. Now, the devil roars and threatens, but his access is limited. Remember, even in the book of Job, in those opening 2 chapters of the book of Job, that Satan could not do anything that God hadn't given him permission to do. One thinks here of the words of Martin Luther in the famous hymn, "And though this world with devils filled should threaten to undo us, we will not fear, for God hath willed his truth to triumph through us. The prince of darkness grim, we tremble not for him. His rage we can endure, for lo, his doom is sure. One little word shall fell him." So the church can expect satanic resistance. The second thing we learn from this particular point in the narrative is that the church is gifted by overseers. The porter is the palace overseer. He is the church's overseer. He's an elder who in this case is probably a reflection of the minister, once again, of John Gifford. We've said this many times, but many times throughout Pilgrim's Progress, I think John Bunyan is describing characters fashioned after the likeness of his own minister, who had been his evangelist and had been his teacher and mentor and discipler. And then he enters into a little bit of a conversation. "What is your name?" And Christian answers, "My name is Christian, but my name at first was Graceless." Only now do you learn the fact that his name actually was Graceless. "And I came from the race of Japheth, whom God will persuade to dwell in the tents of Shem. Now that'll test your knowledge of Genesis and Genesis 9. You know, it was said of John Bunyan that if you pricked him, his blood would flow bibline, that Bible texts would come out of his arteries. And of course, he knew the Old Testament very well. He knew the Bible very well. This is an interesting statement. It comes from Genesis 9. It's the words from the cursing and blessing that follows the episode of Noah's drunkenness. And Noah is speaking to his three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And the Japhethites are the Gentiles, and they're to be brought in to the tents of Shem, the Semites, the Jews, if you like. So Noah is pronouncing a blessing on Shem, a blessing that will extend down to Abram in Genesis chapter 11, and from Abram, whose name will be changed to Abraham, down through the pages of the Old Testament and to the likes, more than likely, of you and me, who are Gentiles, grafted into this vine. Bunyan understood himself as a Gentile, grafted into the vine that is Israel. And then he's asked the question by the porter, how is it that you've come so late? And Christian then retells the whole story. It's a bit like Wagner's Ring Cycle. And every now and then you just have one of those moments and you realize you're going to hear the entire story all over again for the next 45 minutes. And that's because perhaps as the narrative is being told in part, you know, you pick up a book and you put it down, and then you pick it up several days later, you've forgotten the story. So it's useful to have a retelling or sort of recap of the story in the middle of the narrative. Perhaps that's what Bunyan is doing. I rather think Bunyan is doing something else. What he's saying is that in the church, particularly in the 17th century Puritan church, it was also something that was very common in the Welsh evangelical churches of the late 18th and 19th century. And that is that Christians would gather together, and one of the things that they would do in times of fellowship would be to tell their story, to tell their conversion story. Tell me how you came to faith. Tell me how Christ found you. And we've all got different stories. I have a dramatic sort of sudden conversion, like the Apostle Paul on the road of Damascus. I can give you a date and an hour. My wife was a Presbyterian, went to church 3 times on Sunday, sang hymns around the piano on Sunday afternoon. She can't remember a time when she didn't believe. So our stories are very different, but it's not the exactness of the dimensions of the story so much as that you have a story, that you have come to Jesus. But this sharing of our story, the sharing of a testimony. Give me your testimony. Stand up and tell me your testimony. Tell me how you came to Jesus. And I think that's what Bunyan is reflecting in the narrative itself, that on several occasions, and particularly now in Palace Beautiful in the church, Christian tells his story. Then thirdly, the church provides spiritual refreshment. The first thing that happens is that Porter calls for one of the virgins. She's described as a very grave and beautiful damsel named Discretion. And she comes to examine him, quote, according to the rules of the house. And if she approves, to bring him to the rest of the family. Isn't that interesting? This is, how do you join a church in the 17th century? How would you join a Puritan church? You'd have to have a testimony. And that testimony would have to be credible. And that testimony would be scrutinized. And you'd be asked a lot of questions. Questions about the genuineness and the sincerity of what it is that you're saying and your interest in the Lord. And were there evidences of true saving faith? And had your faith been tested in any way? And how had you emerged from that testing? So once again, I think Bunyan is teaching us that in order to gain membership in the visible church and in the visible Baptist church of the 17th century, certain evidences of a true conversion experience had to be given. Right? You were examined, and only if you are found to pass that scrutiny would you be brought to the rest of the family. Now, evidently, Christian passes this initial scrutiny, and Discretion introduces him to three more women, Prudence, Piety, and Charity, who warmly welcome him into the family. And at this point, the three women engage now in a fairly lengthy conversation with Christian, and three things emerge. First is the whole issue of spiritual conversation. Piety she asks Christian to explain the motivations that had led him to undertake the pilgrim's way. Interesting phrase. What had led him to undertake the pilgrim's way? And his answer is, one, the fear of destruction, and that it was as God would have it. And so again, there's this whole matter of spiritual conversation. You've probably been in church, and just before the announcements, there's a holy buzz or a holy din going on, and the minister gets up, and this continues, and you have to sort of quieten the people down. And you can take that one way or another way. One way is to say, these people obviously love each other. They are talking. At least they're not sitting there and nobody's talking to each other. That'd be worse. At least they're talking to each other. But then, over the buzz, you can hear what is the conversation about, and it's about football. It's about the baseball game the night before. It's about where are you going for lunch or whatever. And maybe the conversation is not as wholesome and certainly not preparatory to the words, now let us worship God. And so you have to introduce a sort of section into the pre-liturgy. Let's spend a few moments in silent contemplation, preparing our hearts for the worship of God, or some such thing as that. And I think that Bunyan is addressing the whole thing about spiritual conversation, talking to each other about spiritual things, and thereby encouraging one another. Encouraging each other through personal testimony. Prudence asks about the city he had left behind and the struggles he faces with things he thought would not bother him anymore. And what is it that makes you so desirous to go to Mount Zion? And he answers that by saying, why, there I hope to see him alive that did hang dead on the cross. And there I hope to be rid of all those things that to this day are in me an annoyance to me. There, they say, there is no death. And there I shall dwell with such company as I like best. For to tell you the truth, I love him, because I was by him eased of my burden, and I am weary of my inward sickness. I would fain be where I shall die no more, and with the company that shall continually cry, Holy, holy, holy. And then Charity asks why he hasn't brought with him his wife and his children, to which he replied that his wife was afraid of losing this world, and his children were given to the foolish delights of youth. Now, the next thing that happens in this spiritual refreshment is supper. And there's a wonderful section where Bunyan describes the food that they eat. He's there for refreshment of body and soul. And Bunyan describes the food. And the food consists of things like pomegranates. Now, 17th century England, if you know anything about England, they do not grow pomegranates in England. Not now, and certainly not in the 17th century. For Bunyan even to have seen or even to have eaten a pomegranate was surprising to me. And it was certainly an item of luxury that some merchant who had been overseas somewhere had brought back with him. But think for a minute, Bunyan spends 12 years in prison. I don't think he was eating gruel, but he wasn't eating luxury foods in prison. He was eating probably soup and vegetables that were brought in to him. If you look at Bunyan's picture, a picture was taken not with a camera, but one of these etchings of Bunyan. If you look at him, a picture of Bunyan in his 60s, after he's been out of prison for a decade, he's not short of a pound or two. I mean, he is on the plump side in these pictures. He loved his food. I think he missed his food when he was in prison. I think he loved his food. I think he loved to eat. And I think every time I read passages in Pilgrim's Progress that describe food, there seems to be this. It's not just plain food. It's not just grits and gruel. It's maybe that's not plain food for you, but it's extravagant food. It's luxury food. And in the allegory, do you see what he's saying? That the kind of food that the church serves is luxury food. It's wonderful food. It's food to savor and to enjoy. And he drinks some fine wine and is then taken to a bedroom called Peace. And all their talk at the table was about the Lord of the hill, especially what he had done and why he built the house. The church then is a place that feeds you and nourishes you and gives you refuge from the world. And then he sees in the morning rare treasures. He's taken to a room and he's shown the rod of Moses that became a serpent when it was thrown down before Pharaoh. He sees the trumpet of Gideon's men, Jael's hammer that he killed Sisera with, Shamgar's ox goad with which he slew hundreds of Philistines in the days of Deborah and Barak, and David's sling and the Lord's sword with which he would kill the man of sin, which for Bunyan probably meant the Pope in the 17th century. And especially the family history of the Lord of the Hill is seen. He was the son of the Ancient of Days and came by that eternal generation. And very interesting phrase, eternal generation, that Jesus is a son forever and ever. He always has been a son to the Father. And then, having been encouraged by all of that, then I saw in my dream that on the morrow he got up to go forwards, but they desired him to stay for a while, and so he does. And eventually, more food, vineyards, fruits of all sorts, flowers also, springs and fountains, very delectable to behold as he walks about in the gardens. And then he asked the name of the country that he can spy out in the distance, and it is called Emmanuel's land. And that's the direction that Christian is now going to head to, and we'll see that in coming lectures.